So it just reconstruction, but making connections to the present day.
Thank you, Tom.
Liz, this is Catherine Hill, and I'll echo that. And what we find at Living Museum is that when we help people connect, help people understand their world today through history, that's when when people find us relevant, when they understand why that history is so important. So I think that we have to look at this history through the lens of where we are, and where we are through the lens of where we've been. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Catherine. Minister Mack, I saw your hand was up.
Yes, I like to echo what everyone else has said. I like to also add that the purpose of what we're doing today really is about memorializing what happened at Latta Plantation, and how what happened at Latta Plantation continues to affect the lives of all citizenry of Mecklenburg County. I want to go further to say that what happened in Reconstruction was as harmful. It was a continuum of antebellum. And so it's important that we do have that particular conversation to ensure that we not only give respect to our ancestors, all of our ancestors, but we also all learn from this experience once we come on this particular property. We all learn from it.
Thank you, Corinne. Lakeitha, I see your hands up.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm probably just going to echo everybody too. So, but I do find when my students, I am most effective, and they seem to retain the most information, and seeing when they understand how they are connected. When we teach history in a way that shows everyone that history is not this dead thing, this thing that just happened then. It is a living, breathing, like, organism that is always like with us. Like, so when they understand the decisions that they make and the choices that they make 100 years from now, people will be affected by those things and still talking about those things. So we are still very much affected by decisions that were made and choices that were made. Like, even like simple things like understanding where certain foods that they eat come from. Like, these are not like, you just assume they're just been a part of your diet, but they actually came from a whole other place, and how they are connected to it. Like, if, for example, if a student has eaten a piece of watermelon or eaten okra before, like, I eat that all the time. That's not an American. No, that's not native to this continent. It actually came over with enslaved Africans, and that's how those foods got here. So they, it's like they all just kind of lit up when you make those connections for them, and how they, in this present day, are connected with their past. And I think a lot of times that's where we've missed the mark. I just actually had a talk with a group of students when I started to talk about history. They don't think about being connected to, it's like those people, this happened with those people, but they don't see the connection between them and themselves, the past and themselves. So if we're able to make that connection with the past and the present and the future somewhere in there, I think people will be much more engaged and will retain more information.
I think that's such an interesting point. And I had that thought myself the other day. I was reading a historical book to my son, and I thought, you know, these people were actually people with the same types of emotions and realities that I have today. And I don't know why that is. We tend to other people in the past. So I love what you said about that. And I think that ties in with empathy as well. So,
yes.
Very good. Okay, Carrie, I see your hands up.
Hi, good morning. Yes, I also agree that we should not focus on the word antebellum and consider dropping it altogether. In support of what everyone has said about moving forward in time from through the Civil War into Reconstruction, but also being able to move back into the colonial era. And we spoke, I believe, at our last meeting about including interpretation of the indigenous people that were in the area before Latta Place was there.
Thank you. Good morning, Ruby. How are you? Just to catch you up, we are looking at some proposed vision statements here on the screen and just getting feedback from the group. So I don't know if you want to take a minute to look and provide some feedback. If you have thoughts. I think we've heard from everybody else. So what
Liz, I have raised my hand and you may have missed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just want to say I concur with everyone with regards to not being limited with regards to the antebellum period. I think, as already referenced, that the past is intertwined with the present and potentially the future, and that there's so much opportunity in whatever we do in this space to have learning that is able for people to see, because we're dealing with people. And so there are elements of how we socialize, interact in the past that still manifest in how people socialize, interact in the present. And if we have a better connectivity of what was the DNA of people then, not the physical DNA, but their social interactions, their mindset, their viewpoints about power and control and everything like that, and infuse that with today and the future, it has a transformational experience in learning, not just to learn for a snapshot in time.
Thank you, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Chris, you see your hands up.
You know, all the things that we're talking about, and rightfully so, are very people-centric. And I think that while it may not necessarily be able to be inserted into a vision statement, I do want to make a pitch for things like, why was this site chosen for a house? What did farming practices look like back then? And, you know, how are they different than what we are now? What was the life of these people actually like from a farming perspective? How far, you know, you go out there now and you see Mountain Island Lake, but back then there was just a river. So I do want to make sure that throughout this, we need to tell stories about people, because that's how people connect and they understand. But I also think that being able to have a story about the land and why it was used and why this location and, you know, how the house was built and all this kind of stuff is also something that I think is going to be very important to kind of help weave the whole story together.
Thank you, Chris. Ruby, did you have anything to add?
I agree with what Chris is saying as well. I think that a holistic approach to education awareness is the piece. And what I see here are the various options are good. I agree with removing the antebellum reference. I think that just, again, the holistic approach and looking at empathy as a key piece, but also understanding from each perspective and being sensitive, regardless to what perspective we take, that each time that we do this, we are being sensitive to people's perspectives and their own histories. And the story that is told, that the narratives are consistently accurate, that we don't try to paint something that's not true, but in fact, that we control the narrative, and the narrative has to be accurate.
Yes, Minister Mack.
I just wanted to push back a little bit. I do agree with the last portion of what Ruby said. But I think it's important that the people who were most sensitive to are those who were enslaved, who did not have a voice. And although I agree with a holistic approach to some extent, I think it's important that we don't get so caught up in being politically correct that we are not telling the true story of violence. Because in my mind, this is not about farming. Those who were enslaved were not farming, right? So I just want to make sure that we are clear about how we're telling this story from an authentic, truthful space. That's it.
Yeah, I agree with her. I think that from that perspective, we do talk about the roles that they played. They were doing the labor. They were the laborers. So from a labor perspective, they were blacksmiths. They were builders. They were carpenters. They were horsemen who took care of those who cared for the cattle, etc. So I agree with that. Again, it's a matter of education and awareness and how we word, how we're sensitive about telling the narrative. And that's the point I'm making with that. So I do agree with you on that, Minister.
Thanks, Ruby. Lakeitha?
Yeah, I wanted to add one little quick thing to that. One of the things a few times when I had gone out to Latta to visit and to ask about the education of the enslaved folks that were enslaved there, like where was that information? Where was that interpretation? And the response that I got that they never just had anybody on staff. And that they just didn't have a lot of information or this or that. And but to tie it into what the gentleman was saying before, if you do learn on like what sorts of crops were the Lattas or whoever was cultivating, what were they growing, and understanding that, then you can create an interpretation for somebody like myself to give that talks about what a day in the life of somebody who was enslaved here may have been like. So it is possible, because I definitely don't want to, I don't care anything about political correctness. And being honest is politically correct in my opinion. And but if you do learn about both, like this is like their strategic, for instance, when folks went to look for Africans or to take Africans, they were very strategic in who they took and why they took them. Like certain West Africans were stellar at cultivating rice. So I'm going to take if I'm trying to grow rice, I'm going to take people who know how to do that. So there is a reason why the Lattas did choose this place to live and why they chose the crops that they chose. And if we are connecting those dots, we will be able to create a more comprehensive view of what a day might have been like for a person that was enslaved there. So it just adds to our the honesty in our storytelling if we have all those facts there. So there's a way for them to really truly go hand in hand there, I think.
If we're really honest about getting to that level of the storytelling as well, then we deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the ugly is if an enslaved person did something wrong, what the penalty was. If an enslaved child ate something that they weren't supposed, what the penalty was. If you didn't pick enough cotton or enough of that particular cultivated crop, what the penalty was. So it's no way to tell this story like kumbaya, let's skip through the meadow type thing. It wasn't that kind of life holistically when you look at the whole story. If you want to talk about the life of labor when it comes to a woman bearing children and then feeding that child, then you have to include the nursing of the Black enslaved woman who nursed the white child and didn't have enough milk for her own children. See, this is a holistic hard truth. And so we can't skip over it because it's uncomfortable of what we're saying. it's still a way to tell the story. It's still a way to talk about the land was hard to cultivate because it didn't rain. And, there was only a river at the time. So that meant water limitations, etc., but still tell the whole story. So you're still talking about the conditions of what it was at that time, the labor, the wood, the chopping of the wood to build the house. All those things are important to tell.
I think you're absolutely on point, Ruby. And I think that what we haven't touched on is economics, right? The lack thereof, because obviously there was no economics for the enslaved people, but we need to also look at who benefited from enslavement and what kind of benefits there were at that time. And then you can actually connect the dots through history to look at how enslaved labor then correlates with some things happening maybe in mass incarceration, right? There are ways that we can begin to look at how that particular system continues in some fashion even today.
Yeah. I think it's important that that everybody really can begin to, this is going to be a long road for us, is all I can say. And that the more we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes, from an empathy standpoint of being enslaved. I know somebody says, well, then put yourself in the life of the planter. Okay, so if I put my position in the life of the planter, it still comes back to the economic side of what Minister Mack is saying. Economics was the core of that, and the dehumanizing of people to get to that means, to get to that positive end for the planter. But maybe death and deprivation and stripping of heritage and history for the enslaved, watching your brother and sister to be, so we're going to do the storytelling, then we need to look at Lakeith and say, okay, what about that part when the enslaved brothers and sisters were sold to the other plantation or down the river? If we're going to talk about a river, that's included in the river story because you never saw them again. You were separated from those you love. So there's a big picture of telling the story and in a truthful story. The plantation story is not a pretty story from the enslaved point of view. It's just not.
Lakeitha?
Yeah, I just have one other small comment to make and then I'll be done. Yes, I agree with everything that has been said. And I think what is going to happen is it'll come into play when you start talking about, or we start talking about training interpreters for because they are the ones that will be on the front end of it. They are the ones that will be with the visitors in those moments as they're putting together their interpretations and as they're giving them. And they have to be able to, in addition, not to be so caught up even in their storytelling, not to be able to pay attention to their audience when things are happening, when people are feeling a little bit like distressed, and address it. Because I definitely am very, very honest, and I can see when people are struggling. Even now when all my students are in mask, I can see your eyebrows. It's like your eyebrows are furrowing. What's happening? And feel free to ask questions. So you make sure your interpreters are very knowledgeable, so they are ready. And I will give an example of, I always give the example of the Whitney Plantation. If anybody's ever visited there, had the opportunity, they hold no punches. At least my guy did not. There are certain phrases that I don't use anymore because I didn't know that is where that came from, like throwing the baby out with the bath water. And I did know the one about being sold up the river and what that means, but that also made a connection for me that is where that came from. I did not realize it. And so it changed my behavior. So there's certain phrases that I don't use anymore. So the idea is that when people come in, they leave changed. That's why I think whenever I do a play or anything, I like the phrase edutainment, because you don't have to be bored when you're learning. And a lot of students who make up like the bulk of the visitors that come to Latta are students. Their idea a lot of times of learning is they're going to be bored. But you don't have to be bored. You can be entertained in a way. And I don't mean entertained, we're all singing and dancing and all of that. Just you can really be engaged by the information. And that is going to come from the interpreter and their excitement for what they are teaching. And there can be like a disclaimer that each interpreter gives out that you're going to hear some difficult information today. Let's go ahead and take a moment and let's breathe together and prepare our hearts and minds to hear what we have to say, to prepare for what we're about to hear, something or other. They can do something along those lines. And then what I did love about the Whitney is that even though I heard so many horrible things, but horrible, very truthful things, it still left me feeling as though I can still affect change in my own space and in my own corner, that it's not a helpless, hopeless thing. So it still ended with, there is some hope to affect change. And so if we do that, we'll have a great experience on our hands, if that makes any sense.
Those are great points, Lakeitha. And I want to talk about something we very rarely talk about when we talk about enslaved people. I think it's important that we don't leave that space with the belief that all white people were slave owners and all white people were bad people. Okay, I think that's so important because that's one thing that Whitney does well also. They talk about those who were part of freeing enslaved people. They talk about some white folks who were also harmed and killed because of their support in the emancipation of enslaved people. And so when I say a whole story, I am talking about, the good, the bad, and the ugly as well. And I'm talking about hopefully finding a way to find real people during that real time, and hopefully telling a part of their stories. I think that is so effective when you can connect an individual and see the life of that particular individual and how they either went through this situation, whether they survived the situation, and hopefully there's some ancestors who are alive and know part of that story who can give us some input as well.
Thank you, Minister Mack. This is all fantastic feedback, and I just want to thank all of you for your willingness to share so far. We've got a couple more questions for you too, as we're moving on into talking about our mission. But before we get there, just a couple quick things. So one thing, what I'm hearing is pretty strongly that we need to expand our vision beyond just the antebellum era, that we need to make connections with today. We talked about Reconstruction. We talked about telling the whole story, which is not just limited to a particular period of time. So I put some X's over the term antebellum. One thing I think we could talk a little more about before we move on, and I do have a follow-up question on this later, but it may be worth connecting right now on this topic, is community. So are we wanting to service the Charlotte community? Are we wanting to, is our target audience North Carolina? Is it national? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, Ruby.
I think it's, can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's for everyone. It's for anyone who comes from another country. It's for anyone who is in Charlotte. Of course, our target group, of course, are the local schools and things like that. But when we talk about who is the message for, the message is for educating everyone, that it is done from a human perspective, and that everyone is included in that process all throughout the world. So you go city, state, national, international. It is because we have to remember enslavement didn't just take place in the United States. We're talking South America, Europe. We're talking so much broader. So this story is not just a Mecklenburg County story. It is a much broader story that needs to be told when we talk about education and awareness. That impact is for everyone to be able to learn and grow from those historical truths, regardless to what those truths were. When we talk about community, our community should be global. It may just be your neighborhood, my neighborhood, from us every day, but we live in a global community of human beings made in the same image and likeness. And so there are differences, there are similarities, respect those differences because we're learning more. If we don't have the right facts and education process, our mission should be to educate, to present those truths, what they are, in a way that creates an experience that we leave, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So we leave, even that kid leaves transformed, but that parent also goes to work maybe the next day going, you know, I'm going to try to get to know XYZ better on my job. I realize now that I have a new perspective from my experience and that I'm going to be a different kind of neighbor and a different kind of engaged citizen. So there should be some transformation that occurs at the end of that experience when they leave Latta.
Thank you, Ruby. Any other comments on community?
Yeah, I think the framing of the story would be around Mecklenburg, but it needs to be universal, right? Meaning that we have to find ways to connect the dots or to build bridges. And I think the way we do that in some way is talk about Latta Plantation and then compare it or elevate it in a conversation around other plantations because it was a system, right? It was a way of life. And I think that's the way we make it more global by elevating the conversation around what free labor was, what enslavement was, what having a lack of humanity looks like, and the harms that it does to not just the people who are being oppressed, but to all of society. We all are harmed by it. I think that's the way that we tell that story. I'm excited to hear the final product and see the final product because I believe that this is going to be an opportunity to converse with folks we never conversed with and find ways to begin to build bridges that we never thought about building.
Thank you. Dr. Hanchett, see your hands up.
Let's see. Okay, I've got my mute off. Good for me. I totally agree with what has just been said by Ruby Brett-Height and Minister Mack. And because of that, I would advocate for keeping Greater Charlotte community or Charlotte metro area or something like that in the language because it gives us an accountability. Are we reaching the schools in Huntersville, Mooresville, Pineville? Are we reaching them? If we're not reaching them, we're screwing up. And having that is useful. One of the most telling figures that I've heard in our sessions together is that the visitorship under the previous administration was 90% white. And we are a community that is now no longer majority white. And if we're only reaching one small set of folk, relatively small set of folks in this metro area, I think we're failing. And so having that as a marketing PR, are you reaching folks check, I would argue that putting those words in is a useful thing, and probably metro area rather than community. I'm not sure that folks in Mooresville see themselves as part of the Charlotte community, even though we certainly are all interconnected.
And Tom, isn't it interesting that through the Latta Place experience, we'll be teaching critical race theory.
Let's see. Catherine, did you have anything to add to the discussion about community or time period or anything else?
Well, I think we've covered time period. What I keep thinking about is in this vision statement, are we talking about why this is so important? And we've talked about the transformative potential here for individuals, and I think that that's exactly right. But as we transform the way individuals think, we transform our community, right? And that's why we need to tell the truth in this story. And that's why we need to serve this, why we need to make sure that this is a compelling experience for whether we call it community, whether we call it Charlotte metropolitan area. It's because we are committed to building a stronger, more equitable community, right? That's why this is so important. And I think that the national audience will follow if we do that very effectively locally. Like if in the same way that the Whitney has made a national reputation for itself because it broke the mold. It changed the way we tell plantation stories in the US. But I'm not sure they set out immediately to attract a national audience, but they certainly have. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Carrie, did you have any thoughts about community?
Hi, thanks for asking. I agree with both what Tom and the previous speaker said, that having an accountability to your local region, Greater Charlotte metro area, it's really important to have in the mission and working with the public school system. And I also agree that we could start working on how we impact the transformative experience locally will lead to the national conversation. So I like the keeping Charlotte, Greater Charlotte metro area in the statement. I'm not completely sure about what else to include in that. So that's my 2 cents for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's talk briefly about what a vision statement is before we move on to the mission. So I'm going to ask Katie if you don't mind clearing off the annotation. And I just want to give a shout out to our senior planner, Katie Lloyd, who's on the call with us, who's helping me so much with all of this tech stuff. So I have never done, as I mentioned, annotations with a Zoom meeting. I think it's an awesome tool and she's helping me so much. So thank you, Katie. All right, so what is a vision statement? So as I mentioned, a vision statement kind of gives us that 100-foot view about where we're going. Leslie and I did a little research on this and we came up with these 4 bullet points that we really like that describe what a vision statement is. It's forward-looking, it's reflective of our values, it's motivating and inspirational, and it defines our reason for existence. So with that in mind, and then returning back to these proposed options, and we've cleared all the comments, we've saved all of that, we'll go back and sort through those. Are there any final thoughts about any of these 3 statements? Do these make sense? Do we need to add something? Do we know we probably want to at least take out the antebellum reference? What are your thoughts about these particular vision statements? Are we on the right track? Do we need to change course? Final thoughts on this before we move on and talk about mission.
Hey, Liz, it's Tanisha. Can you hear me?
Tanisha, yes.
So throughout this entire conversation, there were several key words that just stood out to me as everyone was, sharing their input. And I wonder if it may be, if you would even be interested in including some of these keywords in the vision statement. Transformational, empathetic, holistic, engaging, and experience. Those were the words that really stood out to me as everyone was sharing their viewpoints. And I think that's a direction that that not only this group wants to see, but that the public wants to see when we talk about reopening the historic Latta site. So that's just what stood out for me from a marketing PR perspective. I don't know, you may want to include it.
I think it's great. Thank you. So let me make sure I have transformational, empathetic, holistic, engaging, and experience.
Yes.
Did I get them all? Okay, excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Back. Anybody else? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll take all this feedback, kind of take what we've got up here as a draft, do some more wordsmithing, and then when we get back together on the 5th, we'll take another look. And I'm going to share this presentation with all of you. So please, if you have some time or the ability to do so, brainstorm, think a little bit about this. So I think that that's going to be our first deliverable, is what does this vision statement look like? So thank you all so much. And we're going to go ahead and move on now to discussing vision statement, or I'm sorry, the mission statement. So the vision statement is 100-foot. Mission statement is what we do on a day-to-day basis. To start thinking about the mission statement, we've just got some questions for feedback. And as before, I'll be typing on the screen while you share. And if there are other questions or other things that we miss or we need to talk about as well, we can add that in. So the first question I have for consideration by the group is, when reopened, what should visitors leave with after visiting historic Latta? And I'll open it up for conversation.
This is Lee. I'm gonna chime in. One thing they should leave with is information. It should be educational, and it should stick with them.
I agree. You leave with knowledge.
Lakeitha here, they should leave with initial ways how they can use the knowledge that they've learned. How do they apply it to present day and future?
Hi, I think education is important, but I also think self-examination is also important.
Leslie.
Sure, I'd like to expound upon Minister Mack's self-examination and self-reflection.
Chris?
So when we do nature-based programming, we focus on two things. We focus on the education, which is facts and things like that. But we also focus on interpretation, which is really creating a connection with whatever subject we're talking about so that there's an emotional understanding. The communication helps.
Oh, hey, Chris, for some reason, I can't hear you. I could, and then you cut out.
Am I back?
Oh, now you're back. Okay. So
A combination of education and interpretation so that we can not only tell the facts, but we can create this emotional connection to the experience so that people can make choices about their understanding and things that they can do in their life to affect change.
Thank you.
Liz, there are a lot of good comments popping up in the chat, FYI.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I see. Yeah. informative, grounded in historical scholarship. Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Education and awareness. Very good. Thank you. Kevin?
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute there. Yeah, so first of all, great discussion. What I would like people to come away with is that America today, or you could say our society today, is an outgrowth of our history. And our history includes a period of our country's growth where we had slavery. And that slavery was based in racism. So that's a strong, what I think in one form or another, when people visit this site, that's something that they could understand, that they need to understand as part of our history. And to piggyback a little bit on what Chris was saying, within Park and Rec and within the education field, we have what's called an interpretation. And I'm not sure if that's a word that everybody's familiar with, but it's, as Chris alluded to, there's this idea in interpretation, which is a little bit beyond straight education. Education is facts. Interpretation tries to make a connection with the visitor based on their own experiences. So, and you do that through what's called universal intangibles, things like family, things like wealth and poverty, things like empathy, love. Those are all universal intangible things. Everybody kind of knows what those things are. And those are the things that stick with people more than facts. So definitely historical interpretation is an approach to education that will help us get to, I think, all the things we're talking about here.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Let's see. Anybody we haven't heard from? Carrie, did you have thoughts on what you think visitors should leave with after visiting Latta?
Yes, all the things that you have added to the board, definitely. But I'm also thinking about opportunity, that I hope they would leave with some form of opportunity to share the
Carrie, I think you went back on mute.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm not used to doing this on my phone. I'm getting there. Some way of actualizing their experience after they leave. You know, that's something we can think about when we're working to plan the interpretation, you know, and how we're going to have the interface with the visitors, but some kind of opportunity to know how to share it when they leave.
Thank you. Catherine, did you have anything to add?
Well, I agree with what's being said. The thing about the educational opportunities in a place like this, they're experiential, right? And that's what makes them memorable. And that's so it's not about the guided tours where interpreters tell you. It's about offering experiences that engage all the senses. That's what sticks, right? And that's what creates the emotional impact. So as we think about interpretation, I think we have to really think broadly about the opportunities that place-based learning in a space like this offers us.
Great. Okay. Lakita, did you have any comments about this?
No, I think I'm like just in agreement with what has been said so far.
Okay, excellent. And then Tom, did we hear from you on this one?
Folks are articulating this really well. Let me put a specific audience person in the room, or a specific kind of audience person are the people who say, well, I wasn't alive then. I didn't live in the South then, whatever. And this is not a story that often it's phrased as, I'm so glad that this is not my history. And yes, it is. And figuring out ways to connect with people from other parts of the country, other parts of the world. But that's also a reaction that I hear from young people. Well, that's old stuff. You know, it's not part of my world. And helping people, as so many folks on the call today have said, to make these human, empathetic connections is really important. And to have the knowledge to see the echoes of that world in the world that we're in right now.
Excellent. Okay, are there any more thoughts on this question before we move on? Okay, great. And if you all bear with me, I'm taking myself on and off mute while screen sharing because we've got another meeting going on next to me. So I'm trying to make sure I stay on mute. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And Katie, if you would save and clear the screen. Thank you. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this, but I want to bring it back up again. This is the conversation about our target audience. So we have talked about this in a geographic sense, as far as kind of focusing on the Charlotte metro area, and then that would bring us to possibly a larger audience, whether it's national, statewide, or even greater. What else are we thinking when we talk about a target audience? Are we thinking about a particular age, a particular demographic? Do we truly mean everybody? Let's talk a little bit about that. I'll go ahead and open that comment or that question up for comments.
Hey, Liz. Hey, Liz, this is Kay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, how are you?
Sorry about that. I was on the phone earlier and I was trying to chime in, but I think the *6 wasn't working. But anyway, I think for the targeted audience, I think history belongs to everyone.
Thank you, Kay. Okay, so history belongs to everyone. I think that's great. So that is truly inclusive, everybody. Is there anybody else that wants to comment on that further? Is there any particular demographic that we want to target, or are we truly just, this is for everybody? Yes, Kevin. Oh, you agree. Okay. Good.
I'm sure when we do start to promote this, it will be working with Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and the other school systems in the surrounding area, the other counties that are around us, so that hopefully this can be added to their standards of learning when we talk about the varied aspects of the educational pieces to this and the learning experiences. And because it helps to build a holistic child when you can have empathy, or we call it SEL, social and emotional learning. And so in that sense, the audience is everyone. The parents are learning just as much as the students. The teachers and the chaperones are learning just as well. So I agree with Kay.
Thanks, Ruby. Tom.
Ruby, being in the business, said exactly what I was going to say, that having a target in mind helps us make sure that we're getting somebody and then we can work out from there. And school children in the immediate vicinity, and especially their teachers and their parents, but school children, teachers, and parents might be a way of again checking ourselves to make sure that we're getting this universal message focused enough so that an important group gets it.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, Kevin.
Okay, so yeah, again, I concur with what's been said. When talking about audience, and this again gives a little bit back to the interpretive field, we say that there's kind of no such thing as a general audience, and that may be a little counter to what you might think, and that there are universal truths. You know, there are things that everybody, you can reach them universally with things like, again, empathy or family, universal ideas. But when you start to do the actual signage and use the language, you have to really know who it is that you're trying to have understand this message, because ultimately you're trying to affect change. So I would say that you need to think about specifically African Americans in the community. Think about the people who you want to change, which may be only high school educated white Southerners. We also have 80% of Charlotte are actually probably Northerners, or people who have come from other parts of the country. So they need to get maybe a little bit of a different message. So I think that while trying to reach everyone is important, and that can be done, when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of how we interpret this site, we need to have specific audiences in mind if we really want to affect change.
Thanks, Kevin. Carrie?
Hi, I also wanted everyone to consider including the students in our area colleges, not just the secondary public school system, but also the college age students. Every fall semester, I'm teaching, the general education, early history of the US, and then in the spring, I always teach the general education course, US after 1865. And it's been my experience over the last several years that students are coming to college with less and less knowledge about American history, about African American history. I can't speak to why, because that's not my experience. But I think we need to include them as well, because they're the ones getting ready to graduate from college and go out, and the community colleges. I see someone put in the chat, and they're getting ready to go out into the community and be our next generation of adults. So just hope we can include them as well.
Thanks, Carrie. And I'll make a comment on that. As a former secondary social studies teacher, what's happening from where I see is that the fundamentals and the standards as required by law tend to focus on math and reading or English, and then science and social studies have increasingly taken a back seat, which I find troubling, because social studies is really about civics and about our history and how we treat each other on a daily basis. So I'm a little biased, but I do think we have a great opportunity to fill some of those gaps. So
yeah, and if I can comment back to you on that, those subjects are also being cut more and more in colleges, and so they're having less opportunity to encounter that in college as well. So I think that makes our mission even more important at Latta than ever.
Thank you. Leslie.
Sure. Oh, I'm just so excited to hear all these potential target audiences. And I'm thinking from a process perspective, we may consider doing something like the mission statement includes something broad that has like it belongs to everyone and gives some examples, but yet what becomes more profound and important is having the programming when we get to that part of the conversation to ensure that we're doing offerings of services or programming that are targeted to these different populations that we're talking about, be it the school district, be it the collegiate environment, be it, you know, making sure that the programming does do something for a white Southerner in Charlotte versus a Northerner in LA. So that may be the way that we can find the way to build it. So when our mission doesn't possibly exclude somebody and we get stuck with something that pins us in a hole or in a bind, but let it be broad, but yet we are very intentional of how we do the programming. That's just a thought.
Great, excellent point. Let's see. Ruby, I saw you had some thoughts in the chat. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Good, okay. Lakeitha, did you have anything else? Just making sure we hear from everybody who wants to contribute. Are there any more comments about the target audience? I think we got some great feedback here. Okay, let's go ahead and move on then to our next question. So Katie, thank you. Okay, so our next question is about success. What does success at Historic Latta look like to you? And I'll open that up for comments.
Hey Liz, I could take a stab at it. For me, I think what success will look like will obviously be growth over time, and for Historic Latta to become a historic site where, you know, I could be in Salisbury and somebody knows about it. Could be in Greensboro and the folks in Greensboro, you know, they'll talk about the Civil Rights Museum. And then if somebody wants to do something extra, they say, well, have you been to Latta? So that's kind of a success, but it'll be incremental. I get it.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's obvious we want to make sure that it's a high quality experience. We want to make sure that we're reaching people and being able to interpret and educate. I also think, though, it's important to make sure that we're context sensitive, that we're in a park property that we have to be very cognizant and aware of how much space we have, how much room there is, the fact that we are protecting natural resources. So I think that while we obviously want to make sure that people have an opportunity to visit and it's a high quality experience, we need to balance that with the needs of the rest of the property and the other things that are there, so that we can make sure that you know, we have a situation in some cases where our parks are being loved to death. And while I certainly am not saying we don't want people to visit, we just want to make sure that the experience that people are having is in context with the current setting that we have, and just to make sure that we keep that in the back of our mind.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see. Kevin, what does success at Latta look like to you?
That we affect positive change in the community. And that's all I have.
Liz, it's Lee. I think it's really important that it's a draw, but a controlled draw, that it wouldn't be like a festival out there every day, but people will want to come. They'll want to schedule time to be there. They'll want to bring, you know, students from all walks of life and all ages, all demographics there to actually see, you know, what is there. I think there'll be a strong curiosity, and the intentionality that we've used to just get to this point sets the path forward for that to become a reality. And I think that's going to really be good for this entire effort.
Thanks, Lee. Let's see. Dr. Hanchett? Oh, sorry, Ruby, I see your
No.
hand. And then I'll pick on you, Dr. Hanchett.
I was just going to add to what Chris is saying, what Lee is saying, and the key word is accessibility, that this, the Latta plantation is accessible and that people feel like they are welcome there. There's a sense of belonging. It is very difficult for those from enslaved heritages to be feel at home when we use the word plantation, when we use the word antebellum. When we think about those things, that's a big deterrent as to why it's been such a small percentage of African Americans that go there besides our school groups and summer camp groups. It's because it is so associated with trauma. And so as we look at being successful, being able to provide that kind of experience where people are transformed by that learning experience, that they leave different than what they came. Even if they're the highest educated in one area, you've got to learn something once you go through this experience, if nothing more than about architecture or those learning experiences that were there, and to empathize with those who did not have the same freedoms as the planter.
Thank you.
Ruby, I want to chime in. This is Lee. I want to chime in on what you said, and there's a reason for it. I'm reminded of a feeling that I had as a younger person when I was in Richmond, Virginia. I had just gotten out of college. That's my hometown. And I was riding down the boulevard near where the Virginia Museum is. And right next to the Virginia Museum, there is a building. I don't know if it's the Museum of the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Daughters of the Confederacy, but it has these gigantic steel inlaid doors. They must be 12 feet tall. Mm-hmm. And the feeling that I had is that I wanted to go in. I wanted to walk up to those doors and knock and try to go in. But at the same time, I felt a little intimidated. Mm-hmm. Later on, after I got out of graduate school, I got a chance to see that facility. So it's that type of feeling that brings out a lot of emotion that can be transformative, that I would like to, I think that could be associated, probably will be associated with, when we reopen the Latta.
Yeah. Okay.
Lakeitha, I see your hands up.
Yes. So I would say, like, to me, success at Latta would look like comprehensive programming that is always tied to the history or the ancestors that are there. So for example, if I am teaching a class on conservation, because it's a perfect place to teach conservation, and it will help remind visitors to don't love the place to death, leave things better than you left them. And how can you lessen your carbon footprint and all that type of stuff. So if I'm teaching conservation, it still will tie into the interpretation on what a day may have been like for an enslaved person there. And then how do we apply some of the really innovative ways that they used can still be applied to the way we grow things to today, like creating those programmings that is always tied to the history. Or if we're offering a hearth cooking class, which is something that they did do, which I couldn't understand why they did not tie it to the woman that was in the cookhouse. Like, you missed the opportunity to educate people on that. Like, it was right there and you missed it. It's still a really interesting thing to do. It's a fun class to take. But in addition to it, I also learned what the life was like for this woman who had to prepare all these meals, in this cookhouse, and made it possible for the Latta family to have all these fancy parties and things like that. So comprehensive programming that is always tied to the history, I think, would be success.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, Tom.
All of this is well said, and I'm tempted not to say anything, but heck, I love talking. So that the demographics of visitors reflect the demographics of our community here, Black and white, rich and poor, native born and newcomers, young and old, to use the surrounding demographics as a guide to make sure that we're reaching out and getting the folks that we need.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Catherine?
Yeah, I think we have to find a way to make this place essential to the audiences that we want to serve. And that goes back to kind of, you know, who do we want to serve? And I do think you can serve everyone, but not through the same kinds of programs and not through the same kinds of experiences. So it is really, really important that we kind of identify those segments and figure out what they're thinking, what they're worrying about, what will bring them, and make sure that we're meeting them where they are, and also making sure that we create processes that they're involved in the creation of content, because we can't deliver it to them, to any of the audience segments, right? We have to do this with the community, and that's implied in the value statement that we talked about. And I think if we create the right processes, if we're very intentional about understanding the audiences we want to serve, then we can make the place essential.
Thank you. That's excellent feedback. So what I wrote down is, once we identify those segments, it would be important to conduct a little more research on exactly what they need, or what would make us essential for them.
Yes, absolutely. And to create processes where they're involved in content creation.
Thank you. That's really good. Okay, Carrie, I think you're the last one we hadn't heard from. You had more thoughts about success.
Hi, thank you. So success to me looks like, of course, everything that's been said. I love these meetings. I just like being in this group of people where I don't really, I get it. I feel like they get what I mean and I get what you mean. It's wonderful. So the things I have jotted down for success is that, that we're able to tell a complex narrative grounded in historical scholarship and hopefully primary sources that we can get our hands on and put our hands on. And that we are reaching a wide and diverse audience that honors the struggles of the past, particularly those of the enslaved and those that have experienced the racism after enslavement, and also one that builds and renews our community, and that community writ small and large.
Thank you. Okay, any other thoughts about success at Historic Latta before we move on? We have 2 more questions. Okay, thank you everybody for that. That's excellent feedback. And our next question is about, how will we measure success? So we have all of these ideas and thoughts about what success looks like. How are we going to be able to measure our success and share it with the community, with the board, with anybody else who's a stakeholder in this? Thoughts about measuring success.
There are formal processes for measuring, which of course I'm sure we would use from the standpoint of having data collection and analysis and that type of system, or a person that isn't a formal evaluator that does research, and maybe we're taking advantage of, the community, the colleges and universities that offer that type of learning experience for their students, so that it's a shared kind of benefit. But also, I think it's good to do exit interviews. I mean, not exit interviews, but exit questions when people leave or before they leave, because a lot of times we do them all the time at the museum, but once they physically leave, it's hard to get that data. So to have some kind of mechanism at the end of the experience where you can get immediate feedback, whether it's on a computer screen or 5 quick questions that they can just type in their answers, or what was the most memorable thing that those things that can be quickly obtained before that person loses that emotion, that experience itself before they leave. Because once you follow up with the survey in the mail and things like that, that's very difficult to do. But also just actual interviews. You can have a process where people can actually go on the screen and say, today my experience was, and their emotions are there, their person is on screen. We do a lot of Southern recollection memories too with Romeo Bearden's work. So a lot of the way that we collect data is through actual on-screen memory sharing. So those are just ways.
That's great. Lakeitha, I see your hand.
I was going to say the same thing, Ruby. I was at the African American History Museum in DC, and one of the exhibits at the time they had where you could just step in and you hit record and you could just talk about your experience there, which I thought was neat because it made me feel like I was also in the exhibit. Because other people, you could still see people's little videos that were going at one time, but it's an awesome way to collect information. And another thing is if we are able to continue to engage with them even after they've left. One of the things when I worked for the St. Louis Zoo, we all had these postcards and we kept them on us at all times in case we did get stumped like by a question. And it happened sometimes where people would ask and we would, because we were also taught the power in the words, I don't know. Like, it's okay. Don't make it up. Say, I don't know, but I will find out for you. And what they would do is you'd hand them a postcard and they just they fill in their address and you jot down their question. And then later we just do the research, find out the answer and mail it back. And it always brought them back because I had people in my group every time they said, I got a postcard back because somebody did answer my question. They did actually care about the question that I had, because you really don't expect to get it back. You really don't expect anybody to actually care and do the research to find out what you asked, but we actually did care. And that was a part of our job, was to make sure we were answering those questions, and those types of things keep people coming back. So
that's great. It's data collection and engagement at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And follow up.
Yeah, that's great. Let's see. Kevin, how will we measure success?
Well, yeah, and to Ruby's point, what I've seen as well is, after surveys where you answer questions, to take that another step, you can do before and after, what their attitudes are about certain things going into the site and if that attitude has changed. So, a key question for me would be, going in, do people feel like the history of this plantation affects their lives today? And afterwards, let them give examples or ask that question again to see if their attitudes have changed. So that would be one way I would go about it.
Great, thank you. Tom, Dr. Hanchett?
I like being Tom. That's cool. Nope, y'all are cooking. Keep going.
Okay. Catherine or Carrie, any thoughts on this?
Well, the financial support that's going to be critical to keeping this place going. And the more important and essential it's perceived in the community, the stronger the financial support will be. And I know that the county stays close to taxpayers and their perceptions about how tax dollars are spent. I'm assuming county dollars will go to supporting this. It'll be important for taxpayers to feel like this is an important investment of their money.
Yep. Thank you. Carrie?
I'll just add something that may seem obvious is, once we really zero in on the mission, we should be able to identify specific goals that we can attach these data collection and assessment type things to make sure that we're meeting our goals. And if we're not, have some mechanisms in place to make sure we're meeting regularly to discuss whether or not we're meeting our goals. And if we're not, what do we need to change and improve on, and what do we need to continue with?
Great, thank you. Minister Mack, you're there. How will we measure success at Latta? Do you have any thoughts on that?
There's several ways to measure success in my mind. The first is that people are interested in visiting Latta, right? That's the first. The second is that we are able to generate monies to continue Latta and to expand Latta. And lastly, those who were ignorant to our history are now well-versed in our history, and we begin to interact in ways that is more humane and more caring and loving. That's not lastly, this is lastly. Lastly, our students, our students are informed and educated about this part of our history, and hopefully ignited and excited about learning more about history. So that they are well-rounded and better human beings when they become adults, because we've failed in so many areas. So that's what I think.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, thoughts from any of the county team that you'd like to add to this?
This is Lee. I'm going to jump in, and I basically mirror a lot of the thoughts. I think attendance and response. One thing that I've seen as a director of Park and Recreation is that when people come to our facilities and they enjoy them, or they're transformed by them, they let us know. They'll let us know, even if we're not there taking a survey, they will reach out by email and they'll tell someone. So I think that's going to be a strong component, either folks who have gone through the experience where they're actually with a docent or a guide or someone like that, or someone who just goes out on their own, walking through, maybe not paying attention to that. And hopefully there'll be some components of the facility that will allow for a type of self-learning and self-enrichment that I think will be beneficial. So that's what I think it would be, a component of those also.
Thank you, Lee. Anybody else who has a comment about measuring success before we move on to our final question? Kevin, I see your hand.
Just maybe tied to this is the idea, it's going back to the activism part, that people have kind of an action, a takeaway action that they can think about doing once they visited. Provoke people to think about what they can do to make change.
That's great. Okay, thanks everybody for your input there. So with that, we're going to move to our final question. So we're going to talk just a little bit about naming. And this has come up a couple times already in the conversation, but we wanted to put the question out to the group. And this is a tough one, at least for me. Should the word plantation be included in the site name? With all of the things that we've talked about today, about truth and also about perception in the community, what are your thoughts about including this word in the site name? We'll open it up for conversation.
Hey, Liz, my thoughts are, to be in line with truth telling, plantation, that is what it was. So I think, removing that might be moving towards maybe being politically correct or erasing some negative connotations that come with that word.
I think that in part Kay is right, but for me, I think the name of this property should no longer be plantation. But I think that in parentheses we should have formally a plantation, blah blah blah, is what I think. Because I think it is important that people understand that it was a plantation, but because we're in 2021 and trying to be different in how we interact with people, all people, that we don't continue that connotation of plantation.
I agree. It was Latta Place, if I'm not mistaken. That was the name of it, Latta Place. And then I agree with the formerly plantation in the title or somewhere noted in smaller type after that, because if we're talking about empathy and we're talking about being sensitive and we're talking about giving access and being inclusive, and being inclusive also means being empathetic as well. There is a psychological trauma that, and if you all have not heard the term, the legitimizing of the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a current psychological occurrence that happens with those whose ancestors were enslaved. And it is traumatic for a lot of people just to hear the word. You wonder why attendance is the way it is. That's part of the reason when it comes to African-American attendance and the measurable attendance, unless there were school groups, because it is a painful word. Antebellum is a painful word. We don't see it from the planner's point of view. When we look at the landscape and the lawns being so luxurious and all that, it was because of enslaved labor that made it so beautiful. And so what we associate is brutality and rape and all those negative things that happened. And I think it's important too for us to be ready to answer those questions of, well, that didn't have anything to do with me, I wasn't there, but you're a beneficiary of it if you are Caucasian. You might not have lived then, but there are benefits to it today. Generational wealth is a benefit. You might not have been there, but your life is positively impacted by it from an economic standpoint, and we don't have that. So that word plantation is a trigger.
Just really quickly, to kind of to expound on what Ruby just said, to piggyback on her statements. When our white allies who really are in this movement with me talk about their uncomfortability because they feel like they're not guilty of anything and they've gained nothing from this, it's important for me to tell them, in love, but if it had not been for your ancestors' actions, you wouldn't have your wealth right now. You wouldn't have your benefits right now. And that's key. That is key. You know something really, really important, Ruby. If your ancestors had not enslaved my ancestors, you would not be where you are today. It's just that simple. And this is not, to cause a guilt trip, but I want folks, even in this circle of love that we have, who are non-Black people, to understand that it's not our responsibility to keep you comfortable. That's not what this is about. This is about making sure that Black people have an opportunity to breathe finally, and maybe find a way to begin their healing process, because we haven't gotten there yet. We're still traumatized.
Thank you, Minister Mack. Lakeitha.
I guess really my comment would echo, and I can use my brother as an example. The word plantation would turn him completely off because he's already told me he's not watching any more slavery movies. He doesn't even care if I'm in it. He's like, I don't care if you're in it. I'm not coming to see it. I don't want to see it anymore. And me, I'm not bothered by the word because that is the time period that is like my jam, that history. I'm coming because of the word plantation. I'm coming to see what you're doing. I'm coming to see how you're doing it. But I'm not necessarily the one you need to reach. It's my brother you need to reach. How do you get him here? And part of it is, I think after the last like film he saw, he just felt hopeless at the end of it. That's just kind of how he felt, and he just did not want that. So always using that as using hope, like moving forward with love, like we've already said, and making sure that we leave on a note that there is hope, that we learn and we remember. We don't dwell necessarily. How do we figure those different things out? But yes, I would say removing the term plantation or putting it in parentheses in smaller text, because yes, because I don't want to erase the fact that what it was. I don't want to, because that's a slippery slope as well. Like we move that word, it's easy to erase the next thing, and it's easier to erase this thing. And I don't want to start that, but it needs to be there, but maybe not in such large print, because you do want to pull folks in, like my brother, because there's a lot of Black folks who don't want to talk about it anymore because they feel hopeless at the end of it, and they feel as though that's not all we were, which is absolutely true. But this moment in our history just had such a significant effect on us now that we have to talk about it, and not talking about it, it only hurts us more. But yes, I would definitely say it shouldn't be gone, but it shouldn't be like the largest print on the page either.
Great feedback, everybody. Other thoughts on this topic?
This is Lee, and I'm going to put myself out on a limb. I believe the name should remain plantation. There are plantations all over the United States, particularly, all over the southern area of the United States. And it doesn't change, taking the name away doesn't change what they were. It doesn't change the scars that they caused, but it's a snapshot in time for history. And I think that it's almost like people who don't like to watch movies with animals in them because they think the animals are going to get hurt. Or looking at something like Auschwitz, the death camps, they're still called that. And that's extremely traumatic to Jewish people, but that's a part of the history. This is a hard part of history to take. And I think if we try to diminish or minimize the strong emotion that name brings forth, I think that we're just sort of sugarcoating it to ourselves. So there's got to be a way, there's got to be a medium that the name is there and explain what it is and how horrible that was and how we need to learn from that and move forward. Because I think if you change the type, font, or whatever, you're calling attention to that as trying to change something that, in fact, and I'm not a historian, and I would depend on the historians here to comment in more detail, but I think it's important.
Thanks, Lee. Leslie, I see your hand.
Sure, I have mixed opinions with this one. It's a really hard one. I think that we all know it's a plantation. So I think for me, it's what is the truth and what is the history? What was the site really called back whenever? And is the plantation just what was the activity that occurred versus what was the formal name? I think the other thing that's very important is not only speaking the truth of whatever the site was called, but we have this mission things that we talked about earlier, and we talked about transformative. We talked about it having a relationship between the past and the future or in the present. And I don't think we want the connotation of this spot for the present or the future to be harness us in this word plantation. That if we're speaking about today and tomorrow, it isn't about a plantation. And so somehow we have to have this site be timeless and be able to speak for generations to come, and generations to come hopefully isn't that this is a plantation. So I think it's a hard truth that we've got to figure out what's the way to acknowledge what it was, but speak truthfully of how it was named. And so again, I'm kind of blurred in that, but I think we should let history drive what we should name it.
This is Minister Mack. Do you know what the original name of this land was?
No, I don't. Chris might. Chris, do you have any knowledge of that?
Chris?
I don't know if Chris is here. Kevin, you may know.
Yeah, I was going to say Kevin would be the person that would be able to provide that information.
Okay.
The original name, I'm not sure under the Lattas. The Sample family actually owned this longer, and they referred to it as Riverside. And it wasn't back in the settlement times and colonial times, often large estates were given a name. And so that was pretty common. And the Samples knew it as Riverside. It might have been Latta Place originally. It's something I can find out though. I will see if I can find a reference to it.
Yeah, because when I read up on it, it said it was called Latta Place, which I'm comfortable with utilizing again, with that denote to make it denote that it was a plantation. But I don't think anyone called their plantations
Correct.
in name.
Correct.
If I'm not mistaken, they all had some really flowery, beautiful name, and they all referred to it as a plantation. But I don't remember the word plantation being in the actual name of any of these properties. We did that years later.
Right. I think you're right. I'm not a historian in this space, but what the little I do know, I don't think plantation was in it, which is why I think we shouldn't put it in there. I mean, if we're going to speak the truth and speak about the facts, we should call it whatever it was. But I think if we take that as a path, I think we definitely need to do some more due diligence and research and try to understand.
Yeah.
In my readings, it was referenced as Latta Place, and then the historic foundation group changed it to plantation. Now we need to verify that data, but that's what my research showed, that it was called Latta Place. And yes, during those times, these estates were called Woodlawn or Riverside, things like that. So yeah, I agree with that. But I also want to go back to our core values that I think, and I don't know that we will, that was done formally, but I think we need to establish core values and to be able to say that empathy is a core value.
Thanks, everybody. Based on my knowledge, the site was rebranded as a plantation in the 90s. But again, we need to verify. So Kevin, if you could do a little work on that, that would be awesome. And let me know if I can help you. Okay, so we are just about at the end of our time. We've got 3 minutes left. I just want to say, and I think I speak on behalf of everybody with Mecklenburg County, that this was a fantastic session. I just appreciate everybody's honesty, vulnerability, and willingness to share. I know I have a lot to think about stepping away, and I hope that the rest of you do as well. So just a real quick check-in as far as our next steps. Everything on here highlighted in red has already happened or is happening today. So Lee gave his update to the board on September 21st. You can go back and watch that if you haven't already. We've had our 2 first meetings. The press release is going to go out today, and our publicinput.com page will also launch today. We've got site visits to Richmond coming up next month, as well as our next 2 community partner meetings. So just a reminder that our next meeting will be this coming Tuesday, October 5th at 8 a.m. We'll continue this conversation, and then our following meeting on the 14th, we'll meet out in person at the site. Lee, I will, if you don't mind, give you the final word.
Well, I want to thank everyone for participating, and it's very important, and for the comments. I think it's really good. I think we're on a really good path to move forward. And I'm looking forward to our next engagement session and the next rest of the due diligence that we're going to do. And I'm going to hand the baton over to Leslie.
I just want to say thank you. As every day that I come to these meetings, I get more engaged, more enthused about the opportunity. I greatly appreciate everyone's participation, as Liz said, and the candor and being able to speak your truths that you think that needs to be expressed in this forum. Looking forward to continue the collaboration as we move forward on this journey. And I hope everybody has the opportunity to enjoy the sunshine today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.